Hello and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie Couch with Simon Rimmer. Simon's a celebrity chef, author and TV presenter. He co-hosts Channel 4's Sunday Brunch alongside former On the Marie Curie Couch guest Tim Lovejoy. Simon's written 5 cookbooks to date: The Accidental Vegetarian, Rebel Cook and The Seasoned Vegetarian, plus Something for the Weekend and the Sunday Brunch Cookbook, both with Tim Lovejoy. Simon Rimmer, welcome to the Marie Curie Couch.
Thank you very much, Jason. I said to you just before we started this, I think I'm apprehensive.
What is it, you think, the apprehension?
I think probably like everybody, I think that we're all a little bit afraid to show our emotions to a certain extent. But I think it's more, for me, it's more the fact that I am a very emotional person. And I think that there are times when I sort of feel overwhelmed in certain situations. You think, that's, I suppose, is my trepidation, that you think, I hope I don't become overwhelmed in the course of the podcast.
Well, we'll make sure that that doesn't happen.
And
we can always pause and stop. And I think for me, I just want you to feel as comfortable as you can and just share what you feel comfortable sharing. Because what we know is from the people who listen to the podcast and the feedback we get from listeners is people just find it really helpful hearing other people's stories. So I think just share what you feel comfortable sharing. And I think it's just about telling stories really and having a conversation. Simon, I always start with this question. Can you tell me about a significant bereavement that you've experienced in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very sort of poignant week, really. It's a year this coming Friday since my dad died. And, my dad was my absolute hero. And he just faded. He wasn't ill per se. He'd had a couple of heart operations. He got less and less mobile. He had very bad arthritis in his neck. So if he was just sitting in a chair, he got to the point where he had to support his head because he was in constant pain, basically. And I think he just faded and faded and faded. And then he fell, took a blow to the head, got a bleed on the brain. And on the 29th of June, a day short of his 90th birthday, then he died.
Sounds like it all happened quite quickly at the end.
It did. I think that it's a thing when you watch somebody fade through age rather than through illness. I've watched all of my grandparents kind of die in various ways, whether it be heart attack, illness, etc., etc., etc. And whilst I don't think you're ever prepared for the death of somebody close to you, you almost accept it before it happens. And even though I knew that Dad was fading, and I think both my sister and I would make sure that we were making the extra effort for Christmas and birthdays and anniversaries, etc. I think then, yes, when it happened, it did happen very quickly. I was on my way to the gym at 7:30 in the morning on the 28th of June, and my mum phoned me and said, your dad's had a fall, we're on our way to hospital. And I went straight there. I arrived at the hospital still in my gym kit, and then 24 hours later, pretty much, then he died.
Can I ask, as a family, did you have conversations about death and dying? Did your dad ever talk about his own death?
Well, funnily enough, when I was 9, my dad got cancer. And they basically told him, we're going back, I was 9, that would be 1972. 1972, then, as you well know, then the provision for kind of like people surviving cancer was far lower than it is now. And my dad was pretty much told that his life expectancy was incredibly low, that they weren't sure if he would recover from it. So I think it's always been there. But my dad did survive, and in fact had cancer again when I was 18. and survived. So I think with my dad, I think there'd always been this whole thing about being aware of his mortality for his entire life. And I certainly think from my mum's point of view, when my dad got cancer for the second time, then he decided, you know what, I'm going to enjoy my life. My dad fundamentally, he got offered early retirement and so took it. And my dad at the time was 48. So he took the payoff and he still worked, but he worked sort of part-time. And I think that he decided, you know what, I'm not going to chase money. I'm not going to chase ambition. I'm going to actually celebrate my own life and enjoy what I have. And I think, from that age, and he got 41 years of doing that. So I think that there was always an awareness of mortality with my dad. I wouldn't say we necessarily spoke about it, but I think it was always there. Very differently from, say, my mum. My mum is 86, nearly 87. And it's only since Dad's died, I think I've actually become aware of her mortality, bizarrely, because she's an incredibly fit and healthy 87-year-old who goes to the gym 3 times a week. I think she's done something wrong if she catches a cold. So, they're very, not that my dad was ever ill, but I think there was that level of kind of expectancy, if you like.
Mm. So interesting there, just thinking about, your dad being faced with uncertainty and how for him that really altered the course of his life, by taking early retirement and choosing to focus on other things because his priorities changed and I guess what was important to him changed. I was also interested in that experience of you being a child and actually learning that your dad had, as you say, in the early 70s, had this illness where, the outcome might not have been like it was, and the outcome might not have been good. And it might have meant that he might have died earlier and sooner. And that it sounds like, but I'm making an assumption here, that you were told about that and that they were maybe quite open with you about it when you were a child?
No, all I recall as a 9-year-old when Dad was ill was that my mum cried all the time,
okay,
and that my sister and I seemed to spend a lot of time at my grandmother's. We kind of put 2 and 2 together when we got older, because I think, it's still a word that people don't like to say. My mum still doesn't like to say the word cancer out loud now. And I think that certainly back then, it was a word that nobody said out loud. We just knew that he was ill, that he was very poorly. But I don't think we were ever really made aware of the fact that there was a very distinct possibility that Dad might have died. Probably we had the conversation about it when I was probably 13, 14, when you put 2 and 2 together and you kind of realize what was going on and having that conversation. But again, I think that, the reality of those conversations are about, I wasn't very well, but I'm absolutely fine now. I think, which is what we all do. You want to do that whole thing of sort of saying everything is okay. There's no need to worry, which of course there wasn't. At the end of the day, he made an amazing recovery and, and continued, went back to work as per normal from that point. So yeah, initially, no, there was no conversation about it, but certainly I think even now I sort of think, my kids are now 21 and 26. I think at 13 to have a conversation about the possible mortality of one of your parents would be quite a tough conversation.
A really tough conversation. And I think what we say and what we talk to parents about is letting the child take the lead, and so not overwhelming them with a load of information. And the information that you give would all need to be kind of dependent on their age and where they're at, and maybe a bit about what their understanding is of death and dying and illness. And there are people out there who can help parents and help children and young people with having those conversations. But ultimately, what we do say is to have the conversation and to inform children. I think what we know is, like you've just described, you were having conversations with your sister. Yes, it was a different time. You were having conversations with your sister. Cancer wasn't really talked about either. I mean, I remember, I grew up in the 70s and 80s and remember, the big C or the whisper of the word cancer rather than it being spoken out loud. And so I think that thing about you and your sister having those conversations and mum being upset all the time but not really knowing why. And of course now, if that happens, then young people can go online and get access to all sorts of misinformation, which can be even scarier as well. So I think we really do promote, them conversations as gently as possible.
I think the big change as well, Jason, is the fact that now, of course, then life expectancy is so much higher.
Yeah.
We know so much more about it, the advancements in medicine. I think that whole thing about people, it seems, being more aware of their health and actually saying, right, okay, let me just go and check this out. Whereas I think, my parents' generation were, you don't want to bother the doctor, he's busy. So I think it's a very, very different world that we live in now, thankfully.
Yeah. Just wanted to ask about bereavement and your experience of grief and how that's been for you. I know it's still early days since your dad died.
Awful. Yeah, awful. I feel that I've become the member of a private members club that I really don't want to be a member of. Obviously the age that I am, I've got so many friends who've lost parents, and I don't think anything prepares you for it. Every day it affects me. I feel like I'm a different person today than I was this time last year. I feel that I used the word overwhelming at the very start of the podcast. I feel it's overwhelmed me in many, many ways. I was so incredibly close to my dad, and I feel that, it's a very uncomfortable overcoat that you put on grief, and it never fits you properly. But I feel that you just kind of get used to wearing it. That's kind of, how it feels, really.
I've never heard that before. That's a really good description. Are you able to say what is overwhelming or what has been?
I think the whole thing, it hits you in different ways. I think, obviously, grief isn't a straight line, and my grief is different to somebody else's grief. My experience of how it felt from the minute, I think what's a really important thing is one of the things that was incredibly beautiful about the end of my dad's life is, as I say, I went from the gym straight to the hospital, and then my sister came with her husband and her son, and then my wife came with our two kids, and all of us were there for 24 hours. And obviously my mum was there. We shared the last day of Dad's life. And we told stories, and we laughed, and we cried, and we recounted lots of things. And Dad pretty much was in an induced coma because of the bleed on his brain. But we made sure we all got to say goodbye. We all had that incredible closeness. And I think, whilst you never want to sort of go through it, it's a reality of life. I think if I could think of a way that I would like to exit this earth, then I think the way that my dad went, surrounded by the most important people in his life, would be a great thing to do. And he faded away and went to sleep. So that was how it happened. So that first moment when he finally died, then I cried straight away. Some people say that, they can't do it. I as I say, I'm a very emotional person, but then equally, I wanted to look after Mum. I wanted to make sure everybody else was okay. And so those first couple of days, it's a very strange thing, isn't it, when it happens, because there's so much admin to do when somebody dies that you're not even in denial. It doesn't seem real, because it almost becomes, it becomes a legal process. It becomes a logistical process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a load of stuff in those very, very early days where it's about, we need to sort this, we need to sort that, right, what am I going to do about work, what we're going to do about Mum, what's going to happen with this, what's going to happen about that. And then I remember that sort of period from the initial, if you like, admin side of death to then waiting for the funeral being a really, really hard time, when you do feel that sense of loss becomes so very, very apparent. That all of the things that you take for granted, like, my dad was a big football fan like I am, daft little things would be in the paper and you'd go, must tell Dad. And, so all of those little things. It's not the big things that in those early days that get you. That is just there. That's that huge weight on your chest. My analogy about wearing an overcoat, that feels like, you're wearing a very heavy overcoat it's an effort to just walk around wearing it. But the little things were the stuff that made you realize that life is never going to be the same again. That person who was one of the first kind of 4 or 5 people in your life that you would share everything with was no longer there. The person who shaped so much of the person that I am, created the ambition that I have. He was the person I wanted to be proud of what I did. He was the person I think who showed me what being a good father is about. All of those things, realizing that person that on one hand is your mentor and your hero is also the person that you want to show him that all the lessons that you taught me, I'm putting those into practice. And now I don't have that anymore. There's an outlet there that has gone. And that, I think I found in those early stages, incredibly, incredibly hard to come to terms with.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that time of, which you were describing in your experience. And of course, as you've already said, everybody's experience is different. We talk about that lots on this podcast as well, that it's, unique to them and unique to the relationship they had with the person who's died. But that bit of the kind of, heavy practical task mode in those first few days afterwards at getting stuff sorted out. But then when lots of that quietens down and you're left with that kind of heavy silence of the loss in the run up to the funeral. Yeah, I've never heard anybody describe it in a timed way like that, but it's certainly true of my experience myself, personally, when both my parents died and what others have also described. And yeah, it starts really early. Those feelings of somebody just not being around anymore, the weight of it, as you described, the overcoat.
Yeah, and I think as well that, and then as it moves on, if you like, into that next stage, the funeral. I hate to use the word closure because closure isn't what you want at all from it, but it's another punctuation point in the next stage, really. And again, the funeral was everything again that you could want it to be. My dad was quite a religious man. I have no religion at all. My dad was still a Catholic. And so, we've all been to many, many funerals where you feel that the priest, the vicar, whoever, it's a very impersonal kind of message. But because the priest knew my dad and knew my dad really well, then it was really lovely, the fact that, he knew my dad and told a few stories about my dad that I didn't know. And you think how lovely that is. And then I spoke, my daughter spoke, and my sister read a poem. And then we went to my mum and dad's favourite pub and we just had some food, had a few drinks. And it was a very lovely day. There's no other way to describe it. I don't apologise at all for saying it was a lovely day. If you sort of think, the last moment when a lot of people will kind of, have any connection with my dad, then so many sort of friends who were there who had not seen and people sort of, telling stories and being there to show their respect. It was a really, really lovely day. And it was a day like today. It was a lovely sunny day. The weather was nice. It felt like, it was a great, great send-off for him. But then almost once that's happened, then you feel numb. I think that's how I felt. I felt completely numb. I think the next month I struggled to function as a human being. I just felt like all I was doing was going through the motions, that nothing seemed to be important. I think the only thing that was continually focusing me was making sure that mum was okay. Aside from that, I felt like I couldn't tell you anything that happened probably in those first sort of couple of months. I clearly went to work, clearly functioned as a human being, but I have no recollection of anything for those first sort of couple of months afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, certainly in my career in hospice care and end-of-life care and palliative and bereavement care, and the hundreds, if not probably tens of hundreds of bereaved people I've had conversations with, that's a really common theme, that zombie-like state that people describe afterwards, and just feeling like the world is carrying on around you, but that you're not part of it, kind of being completely disassociated and walking down the street or going to a supermarket or, so still functioning on some level, but not feeling part of any of it or anything. Otherworldly, I guess.
Yeah, it is. It's like, it's like when you have one of those like weird dreams when you feel like you're looking down on yourself. It feels very much like that. And I think trying to come to terms with what the new reality is. And I think that inwardly it makes you focus on your own life as well. And it's made me question so many things that I do. It's made me question so many things about the way I operate and how I function and who I am as a person. And it's very disconcerting because I think it puts you completely off kilter. And even a year on now, I still feel that. I still feel that, the way in which I approach life and myself, I feel confused, I think is probably a good word to use. That it's almost, you never want to get over it. I don't ever want us to feel, oh, yeah. I think about my dad every day. I speak to my dad every day. And I never want that to change. And you deal with it. And, the weight of that overcoat is maybe sort of slightly more comfortable. You get used to kind of wearing it, get used to kind of carrying it around with you all the time. But I don't ever want to stop wearing it. I still want it to be there. And that constant kind of weight of grief, I think, affects everything that I do. A year on, it is still early days. A year on, it still affects everything that I do. I think that there isn't a day when I'm not affected by the grief of losing my dad.
When someone's dying or grieving, getting things in order can be overwhelming, especially if people at the companies you're dealing with don't understand what you're going through. No one should have to spend their precious, limited time and energy wading through piles of admin. Companies need to act now to make SADMIN simple for dying people and those going through grief. Sign the petition. Search Marie Curie SADMIN.
What do you think that is, that kind of such significant changes you're describing, that you're kind of feeling and experiencing, almost becoming someone different with different outlooks?
I think maybe there are more contributory factors than just kind of losing dad. I think it's almost sort of highlighted many other things. I think at the end of the day, I'm a 61-year-old man. And I think, that I'm at that stage of life where I think probably you question a lot of things about, I'm on the latter stages, if you like. I've gone up the hill. I'm on the other side of the hill now. So I suppose that maybe those two things are combined. I said before about, my dad decided at 48 that, what? I'm not going to chase ambition anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to enjoy my life. I'm going to celebrate my life. I'm going to celebrate the fact that, I'm a husband, a father. He wasn't a grandfather at the time. And I think maybe there's a little bit of that in there as well, where you sort of go, am I doing the right thing? I can't necessarily sort of change what I want to do, but maybe I sort of question it more. And I think the other thing that I'm very prone to do when I feel any level of upset is I think I do shut down. And I think that, that extreme level of grief from losing dad, I think has made me shut down for fairly large periods of the past 12 months, I would say, where, I will avoid things. I don't think I'm actively avoiding them. I think I'm kind of going, okay, you know what? I don't think I want to deal with it. Maybe burying my head in the sand, maybe just kind of like, wanting to hide from the reality. It's an interesting thing with the way that I feel about the grief of losing dad. It's not just about the fact that he's not there. It's almost that level of emotion that you carry around with you all the time that takes on a different level of importance in a good way. That you think, that this feeling there, that feeling of genuine sort of physical pain of loss is there, and making you question all the things that you do that maybe, I don't know, I'm not explaining this very well at all, that you almost need to acknowledge that is there and maybe take more time to consider options that you have. Yeah, at the end of the day, I've been self-employed all my life. I work too much. I've always worked too much. That maybe it's made me think, is this the right thing? No one wants to lie on the deathbed and say, ooh, I should have worked more. And I wonder if there's a little bit of that it's actually been, like I say, double-edged. I've hit the certain point in my life where I go, is this what I should be doing? And equally, then losing dad has made me go, maybe it isn't. Maybe you do need to properly question this rather than just have it sort of slightly at the back of your mind.
And we know that when we lose someone significant in our lives, then it's really normal to be faced with our own mortality. And so that runs alongside it, which is what you're describing. So you've got those two things going on. I think it's also, just want to pick up where you just said, I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well. And actually sitting listening to you, I think you're explaining yourself perfectly and really clearly. But what I also thought when you said that was, well, you're just figuring it out. And so there's so much of just figuring it out, isn't there, throughout grief and through the process. And it's really important to give ourselves an easier time and not a hard time. And I know this is really easy to say, to be kind to ourselves. And it's like, well, what does that really mean? But, I think, yeah, you're figuring it out. It's early days and there's lots to figure out. And when you were talking about hiding away, and I think that's something that's really common, and I wasn't seeing it as hiding. And I was thinking about, just got this image of a boy who was in his dad's overcoat, actually, which was far too big for him and was heavy. But sometimes he just needed to pull that over his head, just as a way of protecting himself, because we can't do everything when we're grieving and stuff does change, and it's about taking it easy if we can.
Yeah, I think it's good. Funnily enough, I think one of the things which is a really bizarre one that I've become very aware of, we don't have a patriarchal family setup, right? So I've always been surrounded by kind of strong women in my life. I had this bizarre thing a couple of months in of thinking, I need to be the head of the family. We don't have such a thing as a head of the family. But I think because dad was always like the focal point, if you like, but not in a kind of like, not in an aggressive, demanding way. He was just the person that we would all turn to because he was a wise old owl.
And he was your head of the family.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I had this thing in my head where I go like, I've got to take responsibility for everyone and everything. And that kind of like, I don't know if I'm ready for it. I don't know if I'm grown up enough for it yet. And it's in a really bizarre thing because that isn't the way our family works at all. And yet I got this thing in my head that you've got to be the head of the family. Your dad's not here anymore. It's a really weird one.
Well, it's a message. It's a message, isn't it? Some of their messages that we learn when we're young, about death and dying. It's not necessarily our parents sitting us down and telling them. It's just what we're surrounded by, whether we're surrounded by them at school, through peers, through media. We get messages all the time, don't we? And it's funny because lots of them just end up sitting somewhere and then they'll reappear kind of years later. And that's one of their messages, it's like as a son, and I mean, certainly a message I heard growing up in Newcastle in the 70s and 80s. It's like, well, if a dad died, then the son has to become the head of the household.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's really weird because when I was growing up, so my dad's family were Italian. So back in the 70s when, most of my friends, then they would never get a hug from their dad. The dad was sort of barely taught. They were all sort of gruff. My dad would hug me. My dad would cry. My dad was a very, very emotional human being. And I remember being, probably early teens, being embarrassed by the fact that, my mates would come around, we're going to go and play football. And my dad would give me a hug. And then I remember one day when we were going to play in a cup semi-final and my dad said, I'm really sorry, I just can't make it. And my dad started to tear up. Oh, you're so embarrassing. And I remember I'm still in contact with a couple of lads I was at school with. I remember having this conversation years later, within the last 10 years and sort of saying, what happened. I said, I used to get really embarrassed. They said, we were so jealous of your dad. I said, we go home, My dad had never even asked what I'd been doing, didn't really give a damn. He'd come in, it was like, that whole traditional kind of working class families. Dad went to work, came in, his tea was on the table, blah, 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 and then, read the paper, whatever. Whereas my dad was the complete reverse. And I think I've been very lucky with that. I think that as a young man growing up, I never quite understood the whole kind of like, macho man thing, because my dad was never that. And again, come back to that head of the family thing, you sort of go, my dad couldn't have been anything less like your traditional, patriarchal head of the family, because he was a gentle soul.
So lovely. I'm so glad you've mentioned that. I think it's really important as well, for people listening. That's another one of the reasons, I think, isn't it, why our grief is so unique to us, because it's contextual as well. And it's about, where people are born and their cultures and what they believe in and how they've been raised. And I think also, I would totally agree with that, that sort of envy bit of, although my dad was a really gentle man, but I think less tears and kind of less demonstrative. And, I think how lovely to be able to see from, a man you talk about as your hero is somebody who is able to show that men are gentle and they cry and they can be emotional and weak and strong and all of those things. Simon, I'm just aware of the time. I'm so engrossed in the conversation. I could go on for ages, but I'm going to move on slightly. And thank you so much, because you've shared a lot and we really appreciate that. I just want to change slightly. And like I said at the beginning, one of the aims of the podcast is to encourage conversations around death and dying, because what we know is when people prepare for death, then there can be better outcomes often for those left behind. And can I ask, do you ever think about your own death?
I do. I think that it doesn't fill me with fear or dread at all, really. I think I'm very fortunate. I have a nice life. I think that, I quite like the person that I am. I think when the time comes, then you hope that you're surrounded, again, in the same way that when Dad died, that you're surrounded by people who love you. But it doesn't scare me in any way, shape or form. It really, really doesn't. I think, at the end of the day, we're on a journey. I think what you want is a quality of life in your lifetime. I suppose, like most of us, you think what I'd quite like is one day I just don't wake up. And I think that that's kind of what you think about. But I don't ever sort of think, I'm really worried about that. I genuinely don't. If I didn't wake up tomorrow morning, well, one, I'm not going to know about it. And I'm sort of thinking, well, you know what? My life has been good.
Is legacy something that's important to you?
Yes, I guess so. I would like to think that, if you were talking to one of my kids on this podcast, that they would say the kind of things that I've been saying about my dad. I think that would be a nice thing to do. I don't think I'm particularly worried about legacy in terms of, I don't need a tombstone kind of sitting around somewhere saying what a great guy he was. But I think you want to feel that, that you've lived your life in the way that you feel happy with. I don't think I'm too worried about it in terms of like, saying, oh yeah, that's Simon Rimmer, blah, 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 blah. Maybe with my immediate family, same as my dad did. But apart from that, then nah, not really.
What would your children say?
I mean, I think since Dad died, I have thought about that. And I think that my kids would say not dissimilar things to the things I've said about Dad, apart from the fact I think my kids would probably say he worked too much. He actually should have been a bit easier on himself. I think I'm quite hard on myself, I think that, but I think anybody who is self-employed and ambitious is hard on themselves. Your own worst critic. So I think that my kids are very aware of it. I think they would say I'm gentle. I think they'd say that, I'm sort of, I like the expression of wise old owl, which is what my dad certainly was. I think I'm relatively sort of wise in that respect. So I think they'd be nice about me. I bloody hope so.
Oh, I love the wise old owl as well. Simon, are you happy to share your dad's name?
Of course. Yeah, so my dad's full name was Peter Felici Grigioni Rimmer. His middle name, Felici, was named after his uncle Felici, who was a jazz saxophonist. And there's a really beautiful picture that we have of my dad's uncle Felix holding my dad in one hand as a baby and his saxophone in the other. It is the coolest picture ever.
That sounds great. Just one more question before we finish. How has it been today being on the Marie Curie couch and having these conversations?
You know what? It's been lovely. I think that, a lot of the things that I've said are things that I think have been in my head and I've not said out loud since Dad died. And as I said, it's coming up to the first anniversary of his death. And I think it's a very, very poignant week. And I think it brings so much of it back. But I think, as you said at the start, Jason, I think having conversations about death, about grief, is what we should do more of. And I think that over the course of the year, as a family, then we've certainly shared what we feel. And I do think that has been very, very important. And I think, that all of us on different levels at different times have done that thing of saying, oh, you know what, I'm just feeling really low about all this at the moment. And just saying something as simple as that statement so that everybody knows that there's, that something is happening. So I think that, the purpose of the podcast is absolutely brilliant. I think that those conversations, whilst they can be difficult, are essential. I think that, actually saying those words out loud. And I think the other thing, I love the fact that you like that expression that I've genuinely coined myself of putting on that overcoat. And I think that there's something very good to be done about trying to visualize something that almost takes you to a place that gives you a little bit of comfort. That great expression of the black dog for depression. I think that those kind of expressions, I think, are actually very, very useful. And I came up with that sort of quite early on, and I like it. It helps me. It helps me feeling that, today the overcoat is feeling heavy. And I think, finding those kind of expressions almost help you with the ability to then say things out loud, because you're saying them with the weight of that overcoat on you, rather than just sitting here with my black t-shirt on, So I think there's something that works for me. As I say, everyone's grief is in, but for me, I think it's been a very valid tool.
And the overcoat sounds also like it's changing, because in the beginning it was the wrong size and it was really restrictive, and then it moved to the heavy weight, which at one point you said that you didn't want to take off. And so it's becoming a comfort, I think, as well as an uncomfortable restriction, maybe, which is what you're describing, a bit like the black dog, because big black dogs can be lovely, when they're licking your face and you're rolling around the floor with them. And it's a great one, the overcoat. And when you were talking about the overcoat, I was thinking of the comfort bit. I was feeling comforted by it, even when you were talking about how restrictive it was in the beginning. So thank you for sharing that bit. Simon Rimmer, thank you for joining me on the Marie Curie Couch today.
Pleasure, Jason.
Thank you for sharing a bit of Peter's story and just being so open and honest. And I hope it all goes well on Friday, and great to meet you.
Oh, thank you.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie Couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help, from planning ahead to coping with bereavement. You can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 090 2309 or search Marie Curie online. This podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Content. The music featured is Time Lapse by Pan-Oceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Until next time, goodbye.